If God is real, why isn't there more evidence for his existence? Well, I'm here to argue that the reason that many atheists and agnostics refuse to believe in God is not because of a lack of evidence. I would argue that even if they were given irrefutable evidence, they would still refuse to believe because the problem is not in their head, it's in their heart. This video is inspired by Mike, a man who went to one of my best videos demonstrating evidence for God and his existence and commented, quote, "This is not evidence for God. We need to see a physical demonstration, not subjective reasoning," close quote. His comment reminded me of the words of Neil Shenvi, who in his book, Why Believe, said, "The hiddenness of God is often proposed as evidence that God does not exist." Atheists who advance this argument can affirm that there may be some evidence that God exists, such as the Big Bang, the fine-tuning of the universe, and the existence of objective moral facts. However, this limited evidence is far less than what we ought to expect. If the Christian God exists and loves us, and if our eternal destiny hangs in the balance, why isn't the evidence for his existence absolutely undeniable? Surely a God who could create the universe could routinely perform unmistakable miracles, like regularly sending angels to materialize in the center of Times Square in the presence of thousands of witnesses. The absence of such extraordinary evidence, then, is an indication that this kind of God does not exist. But I contend that a lack of evidence is not the ultimate reason for mankind's unbelief, and I offer this example as proof. I want you to imagine for a second that you put your smartphone down and you head to bed. Right at that moment, Jesus appears right in the middle of your living room, and he shows you the nail prints in his hands and performs miracles, multiplying whatever you had for dinner and turning your tap water into wine. In other words, I want you to imagine, just for the sake of argument, that he gives you whatever evidence you need to completely convince you intellectually that he is God, that he died on the cross for your sins, and that he rose from the dead. The question I'd like you to consider is not whether you would believe that God exists or that Christianity is true, because we're granting for the sake of argument that these issues have been settled for you. The question is this: how do you feel about him? At that moment, what if Jesus said to you, "Now that you know I am God, I am calling you to become my disciple. That means that you must take up your cross daily, dying to your own desires and demands and seeking my will in all of your decisions. I must be more important to you than any human relationship and even more important to you than your own life. You must put to death all of the sins that you love and that seem so natural to you, even if it feels as difficult as plucking out your right eye or cutting off your right hand. Your money, your friendships, your sex life, your career goals, your entertainment, your entire ethical framework, your view of the Bible, everything must be reevaluated in light of who I am. I want you to devote your whole life to my mission, serving others and loving them and sacrificing for them, warning them about God's coming judgment and pointing them to the forgiveness of sins and salvation that only I offer. Tell all of your friends and family the bad news that they are sinners and the unimaginably good news that I died to rescue them from hell. Devote yourself to prayer and to worship and to friendship with other Christians, to membership in the local church, and do all of these things not grudgingly, but joyfully. Be honest. How would you feel about Jesus now? I'll be honest. Part of me would feel claustrophobic because even as a Christian, part of me wants to call the shots in my own life and wants to be my own ultimate authority. God's demand for our complete allegiance makes us feel uncomfortable. Why? Because deep down inside, we want to be our own gods. And if that's the case, isn't it clear that evidence is not the ultimate issue? Because even if we had all of the evidence we needed to convince us intellectually that God exists and that Christianity is true, there still would be a volitional, emotional barrier between us and God. That is why, at least from a Christian perspective, the objection from divine hiddenness is weak. Sure, God could have provided more evidence than he did, but what makes us think that a world full of people who believe in God but still hate him would be significantly more desirable to God than our current world? Being intellectually convinced of God's existence will never change how we feel about him. The Bible tells us in James 2:19 that even the demons believe and tremble. They have a greater intellectual belief in God than human beings have ever had, and yet they rebelled against his authority and followed the devil because that intellectual belief did not remove the pride in their hearts. God's purpose has never been to change our minds, it's been to change our hearts. Perhaps this answers the question as to why there isn't more evidence, because a person can be completely intellectually convinced that God exists and still fail to love him. Now, if that's true, then maybe we have to evaluate the question of why God hasn't given us more evidence. Sin is so embedded in the nature of mankind that cognitive, intellectual knowledge of God's existence will never eradicate the same sinful, prideful desire that caused Adam and Eve to be deceived. And that's that deep down inside, we don't want to love and worship God because we want to be God. Mankind is not in need of more information for our heads, but more inspiration for our hearts. This is why sometimes far more important and impactful than our very best apologetic arguments is prayer. Pray that God will change the heart of a person so that the gospel of Jesus Christ will not only penetrate their ears, but more importantly, it'll penetrate their heart.